Welcome back to Citizen One, Exploring Our Urban Future, an Urban Next original podcast series. I'm your host, as always, Douglas Stewart McDaniel, and with me today is Ryan Short, author of the Civic brand and founder of Civic Brand. Ryan's work cuts through the noise of place-based marketing and smart city buzzwords to ask a more fundamental question. What do cities actually believe about themselves? His book challenges the idea that identity can be designed from the top down, that you can hire a branding agency and suddenly have a sense of belonging and place. Instead, the Civic brand argues that true identity comes from within, from how people live, remember, and fight for where they're from. In today's conversation, we're going to talk about what happens when design, governance, and culture finally start speaking the same language. We'll look at three powerful case studies from Ryan's book: High Point, North Carolina, Austin, Texas, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, each showing what authenticity looks like when it's practiced, not performed. We'll also take the discussion a little global, exploring what cities like Barcelona and Costa Rica can teach us about civic identity, belonging, and how to stay authentic even as your story scales to the world. Ryan, welcome to Citizen One. Before we dive into your book, tell me a little about yourself and your background and where you're coming from.
Yeah. Hey, Doug. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Appreciate your time. Excited to dive in today. So yeah, as you mentioned, I run a firm called Civic Brand. We work with cities primarily across the U.S., helping them rediscover their identities and like you said in your intro there, kind of find that shared language. Um, yeah, we've been doing this for 17 years, and the big thing that we learned and why we wanted to write this book is that we kind of felt that branding and specifically place branding almost needed a rebranding of itself, and that's what the book sets out to do, because I think when people hear the term branding, they immediately start thinking different things than we're often talking about. And so excited to kind of unpack that and dive into it with you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think we're all familiar, and I was a community activist for many years in Knoxville, Tennessee, working on historic preservation and placemaking and a lot of civic identity. And, just the whole, I guess, 90s into the 2000s vibe of live, work, play, downtown revitalization has become so tired and cliched. And, I think when a place like Knoxville started to embrace itself is when it resurrected this term from the 1950s when it was pretty dirty and industrial. And it was called in a national magazine, the Scruffy City. And, I think by embracing the Scruffy City, you get more to the heart of who the people are and what they're about. So talking about your book, what you write that a civic brand is uncovered, not invented. What are cities missing when they start with a slogan instead of a soul?
Yeah. I mean, I think, when you ask that question and you say the soul piece, to me, I use the phrase in the book that identity has to be rooted but reaching. And I think that rooted piece to me gets to the soul and to like the scruffy city that you were just talking about. It has to be based in authenticity in what you actually are. But at the same time, I don't think a brand is just purely perception. I don't believe that it's just a mirror. I do think it needs to be reaching, but not too much. It can't be, fake. It can't, but if there's not a somewhat of a level of aspiration, it doesn't become that North Star. There has to be some level of aspirations so that you all have something that you're working towards and driving towards. If it's too far out and it's just a slogan or tagline that's disconnected from reality, people see right through that. So I think if you get that balance right of like, it's rooted, it's based on the community's soul, but there's just enough of that like reaching of this is where we're headed. It sends a signal to the residents. It gets them inspired. It sends a signal to investors and visitors. People want to be part of a place that feels like it has a direction and it's headed somewhere. And so that's tricky because it's easy to like fall into slogan writing and, just try to, come up with the new version of live, work, play where you're headed. But yeah, if you can find that balance and it can be based in reality, I think it's a lot more powerful.
Yeah. And, I feel like we've got a lot of examples where would you consider that too often these branding exercises are too externally focused? It's about the tourism, bringing people in, the heads and the beds, and or industrial or high tech recruitment, as opposed to really involving and integrating the districts and the people and the work that's going on in various parts of cities.
Percent. I mean, I think and the reason that happens is naturally, you have different organizations and entities like a visit organization or an economic development, and they are literally tasked with, and sometimes their budget comes with constraints of how they can spend that money. And so, yeah, they often are looking outward, trying to bring visitors in, trying to bring investment in. But when too many entities are just purely looking outward, obviously you can very quickly do the math and see where that gets problematic pretty quick. And so I think thankfully more organizations are shifting from purely a destination marketing only to destination management. And, a lot of the work that we really try to push is aligning between these groups. Because if you have a visit group that's speaking to visitors, economic development groups that's speaking here, chambers, realtors, you have all these different entities, but they're not coordinated and they're not looking inward, it's just a mess, right? And so, yeah, I think that in starting inward, even if you are, I mean, I just returned from a conference last week in London, City Nation Place. It's a great conference, but it's really interesting because you see from all over the world different people that are tasked with either branding or marketing or promoting places. And there's a stark contrast between places that are purely, it's all about just promotion. And then there's places that it's purely about shaping internally, like who are we and really getting at that ethos of a place.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned destination management versus destination marketing. Could you unpack that phrase a little bit? Destination management?
Yeah. And so, I think a typical visit organization like a convention and visitors bureau or DMO, they go by a bunch of different acronyms and names, but historically they're tasked with marketing a place, right? And you might hear the phrase like heads and beds, meaning they're tasked with how do we get visitors to come fill up our hotels. And so it's purely a marketing standpoint, but there's been some silver lining through some tragedies like COVID and different things where certain entities have recognized that, oh wow, it's really going to benefit us to manage our place as opposed to just market it, and that's could be something as simple as your trails are overrun because everybody's, trying to go get that Instagram photo at the exact same trailhead or same waterfall. So it's overcrowded. And so instead of just purely marketing that, you need to manage it and maybe distribute people out across your system or your city or your region. And so yeah, I mean, I think marketing is still a part of it. Places need visitors, they need investment, but you can't just have like a blind eye to just that. I talk a lot in the book about the idea of a triple bottom line. Profit is one of those things, but the other things are people and planet or place. And destination management is just thinking about all of those. It's not just how many visitors can we get. It's, well, how do those visitors support our local people? Where do those visitors go? How does it impact our environment and our built environment? So it can be as simple as just a mindset shift, but it can also be a really formal organizational change and change like how they're funded and how they're legally allowed to spend their marketing dollars.
What I hear, kind of an undercurrent of that is also it seems to be you're implying some experiential quality as well. Like not just, pick a city anywhere in the world, but like you say, the Instagram hero shot at the bridge or the sunrise shot. It's more about managing all of the cultural and assets and places to visit and making sure that I guess all boats rise maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that make a place special and make a place worth visiting. And if in the spirit of attracting visitors, you ruin those things or you lose those things, well, that's a problem, I've heard the phrase like a place gets loved to death, and that's where you kind of get into the over tourism. And, there's a lot of places that would kill for some over tourism because they're desperately needing that. But even in those places, it's about the right investment, the right visitors, and people that are going to respect and value what you have and not want to change it. So I think it's a lot of just like finding the right match. And then once you have those visitors there, like, at least my take, I mean, one of the reasons I like to travel is to learn about a place's culture and their art and their food and what's different about them. I'm not, there to bring my own food, my own ideals, my own art into that place. And so I think part of it gets into just that education piece with the visitor and that kind of mutual respect of you are coming here, you're a guest to our place. So there has to be a level of management, I mean, if you're throwing a party at your house, yeah, you want your friends to come over, you want people to be respectful to your house, but if all of a sudden 1,000 people more than you invited show up and they're trashing your house, you're going to want to shut that party down pretty quick.
I actually had that experience of when we were on a historic home tour, and in one weekend we had 1,650 people through our house, and it was like our house was loved to death. But we had weirdos coming through on the tour who were shining black lights on our artwork, doing crazy stuff. So yeah, I mean, and that's a microcosmic level, but it's about creating the experience and the identity of the city as a whole. And I think that gets to, how a lot of your work involves, and a lot of your discussion in the book involves rebranding. And before you rebrand, you have to unpack the identity of a city and its whole civic meaning, right? So how does that unpack that process a little bit? I mean, and I'm not talking about new logo designs and all the stuff that we all cringe about when cities start talking about rebranding, or when corporations talk about rebranding for that matter. But it's like, where does a rebrand start to actually feel authentic? And what has to happen before that rebrand can even stick or make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think, big thing that we talk about a lot with our clients is that if there is any level of what can feel like a rebrand or a change or a shift in how you're going to be communicating or what you're putting out there, is you really have to earn it first. A lot of communities, they do the hard work, they do the engagement work, they do the listening work. Maybe they do everything right. They surface internally, they understand who they are at their core, and then they're going to put out this like new reframed or repackaged message. But a lot of times they have a lot of work to do. They actually need to use that brand and that North Star to make some decisions. Maybe it's making some built environment improvements or policy changes. And so, when I hear like what has to happen to make it stick, is I think you have to earn it first. And so, we talk to communities a lot about, don't just like throw this big brand reveal launch party and celebrate it because people are going to be like, what changed? Instead earn it. Like start to slowly roll out things and let people see it and feel it. That's where I think cities get in trouble with these, like, you see the people pile on social media or the press with like a rebrand gone wrong, the Cracker Barrel.
I was going to say, and let's not pick on any cities, but let's use Cracker Barrel as an example here. Yeah. That's a tough spot for any CMO or CEO to be in, or mayor, or CVB as well. So how do cities avoid that? What are the risks and the rewards there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the Cracker Barrel situation is interesting because, I used to say like, a brand and a corporation, like they can just rebrand or pivot on a whim, right? It's their choice. They can go wherever they want and the market will either
Right.
follow or not. But
Yeah.
clearly
Right.
people, they love the old man and the Cracker Barrel logo. And so I think what places can learn from that though is, you know, you need to follow the people. You need to follow your customer. And in a city, your customer is your locals, right? And so in that instance, you wouldn't just rebrand and head a new direction that your locals are blindsided by and that they're not already a part of or supporting. And then I think beyond earning it, you know, it's tough because press, these days it's kind of about clicks and social media. And so you can have, yeah, I mean, I've seen it on projects, not projects we've worked on, but, colleagues that I really respect where they do really quality work. It's this really intentional, really deep project to revitalize a community. It's really deep, has a lot of actual improvements for the community. And the press leads with city paid X for a logo. And it's like, that's not what happened there, and then the people will pile on with the comments of like, do we think a logo is going to fix our town? What about the homelessness? What about this? What about this? And it's like, they're missing the point, and so that's unfortunate, but I do think the onus is on the leadership of the community to like communicate. Why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we
Yeah.
spending the money and what's really happening here?
I would go a little deeper. It's not just communicating, but it's also listening. And I've seen way too many meetings for air quotes, public participation that were about patting the public on the head and saying, we listened to you. We already have the plan. We already know exactly where the signage is going, what we're doing, what we're going to call it. But we wanted to kind of let you know through public meetings, but we've already decided, it's already baked. Would you
Yeah.
agree, or have you seen that as well?
100%. And to be honest, that's really why we started Civic Brand the book has 3 chapters on public engagement. The reason we started this is we saw that and believed that cities were doing public engagement wrong, that at its best, it was kind of tokenism, and at its worst, it was like completely ignoring and disenfranchising entire segments of the population. And yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of engagement that is meant to just kind of make the report look better and hit the demographic numbers and show that you did it. But to your point, they've already either made that decision or they're heading down a path. And I think it's tough. I think it's city leaders often do get put in a tough spot because they want to be able to, you know, city staff and consultants need to have their expertise and lead, but they need to listen first and understand, who are they leading? Who are they designing for? They aren't just designing in a bubble. But yes, I would 100% agree that engagement is still pretty broken, but that's one of the reasons we set out to even do this work.
And then another thing I wanted to hit before we jump into our kind of our second segment here, if I may, going back to Cracker Barrel, it was more than the logo problem. It wasn't just the old man on the porch. It was also the interior design. And I'm using restaurants as an analog to cities for just a second, if you'll allow me, because I find that exercise interesting because you know, I'm a, I'm a solid Gen Xer and, growing up with, I remember the original Ruby Tuesdays right off Cumberland Avenue in Knoxville. And Ruby Tuesdays was fun. It was unique. And, it was the Fern Bar, all that kind of jazz. We know what that is now. And there were TGI Fridays. But then everybody rebrands and they homogenize their interior design, their public squares on the city level, where everything's got to have the breweries, the Edison lights, the craft beers, and don't we almost risk this whole ubiquity and I'm getting back to what you're talking about with identity first in terms of civic design and civic meaning. How do you preserve that sense of place and not just create neo hipster culture that's just like everywhere else, every other city?
Yeah, I do think it's a real problem. And I think it's kind of ironic that, what could be viewed as good design is actually the problem. Because if it's good design, but it's everywhere and it's homogenous good design, I think that's a problem. If I go to a coffee shop in Barcelona or a coffee shop in Colorado, I kind of want them to feel different, right? And I think when you go to these coffee shops and you look at Airbnbs around the world, you look at interior design, you look at the design of cars, websites, brands, everything is like kind of just merging in the middle. And it may be like good design, there's probably nothing wrong with the new interior design of the Cracker Barrel stores.
Checks all the
But
boxes, like
it,
the new
it
McDonald's and the new Ruby Tuesdays. They're all
right.
looking very similar.
It's clean, it's on trend, but it lost its
Color.
soul, and at that point you're the same as everybody else. And so what's the difference between the Cracker Barrel that's been around for a long time and the brand new restaurant that can also and so, I think globalization of design, there can be benefits of that because like more people like recognize good design, they see the value of good design. But man, I think it's really sad when businesses and places lose their soul, to use your word earlier, like in the spirit of good design. I'd almost, I'd rather go to, if I'm thinking, I'd rather go to a restaurant that maybe has technically bad design, but it feels very authentic. It's kind of the hole in the wall place that like, yeah, I wouldn't choose that font in this, but that's because that's not my culture. That's not when they just kind of go to this global good design. So yeah,
I
I
can
think
take you
it's
to some great next time you're in Barcelona, take you to some great places here that'll just kind of blow your mind as far as not just local culture, but just utterly, unique thinking and really creating something special in very humble spaces. It doesn't have to be a grand palace. It doesn't have to be some, waterfront bar or restaurant to feel special. I do think, and you do talk about cities having kind of an identity crisis. And is the ubiquitous design part of that identity crisis, or is there more to their identity crises?
I mean, there's more to it, but I think it's a huge part of it because a lot of cities are looking at outside, developers and investors to come in and like rebuild their cities or improve their cities, and they're going to do so very quickly. and they're going to use good design, but it's going to be this kind of just global aesthetic that just kind of levels it up. And I think in a place that's struggling, that can be a very attractive, right? If you live in a town that doesn't have a coffee shop at all, you'd probably kill for that kind of hipster coffee shop that looks the same. You'd love that. And it probably would be great for your town. But in a town that has an authentic coffee shop that's been there for a long time, if it gets replaced by that, that's where it's a problem. And in the book, I actually shared this story of when I was a little kid and kind of starting to realize that I was a designer. Is I remember going into restaurants, even as like a 5 or 6 year old, and I, as a kid, I would look at the menu and be like, "Why is the menu laid out this way?" I would redesign this menu, and I would change these lights, and I would start mentally redesigning this restaurant. And the reality, when I think back, is like, you know what? Some of those probably technically would have been improvements, but I would have just been doing the kind of homogenized, whitewashed Cracker Barrel redesign of these places because I was a kid. I didn't know anything about the culture of this. I didn't know anything about this food, the restaurateurs. So when I speak to design students, I talk to them all the time because we can all come in and prescribe good design. You can walk down the street and go, oh, if they just added some string lights over here and modernized this font here, it would improve their town. And part of it is like that probably would be a positive, but if in doing that you kind of erased the culture, then it's a negative. And so I just encourage, designers especially, like, before you design, just stop. Just listen, learn, and then design. Because it's too easy to come in and prescribe and say how you'd start fixing up a restaurant or a city.
Yeah. And I realize this is an absurd proposal, but I would encourage planners, designers to walk the city and get lost in it and go into the undiscovered alleyways and districts where some, little offbeat art gallery and you're going to get new ideas from the most humble places as well, not just the loudest and the shiniest and the with the heaviest branding.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you said that because, we had actually evolved our process over the years because, when we would work with a community, one of the first things we do is we go on a little tour of the community, and we quickly realized, or actually not as quickly as I'd hoped, but we learned, oh, we need to go in first on our own and just naturally explore this community as a visitor would and go, turn left where you
Sure.
should turn right. Because we realized we were getting the red carpet tour, so they were intentionally like avoiding certain blocks or streets and they were showing us the cool part. And we needed to kind of just see it as is. And so we intentionally schedule the first thing we do when we visit a community on a project is we are not with the client. They're not taking us around. We're discovering it on our own. And I do think that's really important. And then even just it is amazing though, even when, I mean, we've worked on projects where a city has been working on a redesign of a corridor or road for multiple years in kind of like the early like planning stages. And the team working on it has never actually walked the corridor. We did that recently. We took them out and did a walking tour, and they were like, "Oh yeah," because we asked them questions like, "Where were you most comfortable along this stretch?" And it was like a lot of input was when we were under these like trees, there was like shade. It was nice. It felt a little protected from the cars. And then we looked at their plan. It was like, well, your current plan is removing all of these trees. Have you ever walked this? So yeah, getting out there and experiencing a city. I mean, how can you design a city if you're not out there?
Yeah. And I had a recent essay I published on what I call Waffle House urbanism, and I know it sounds pretty rough as a term, but it's that whole it's the I was really curious to unpack what this ribbon development really is and what is a strode. It's not a street, it's not a road, but it's where you've got all your Home Depots and your Waffle Houses and your Shoney's and whatever. And I was recently in Savannah, Georgia on some family stuff, and I didn't rent a car while I was in Savannah. I was renting a car as I was leaving to come down to the Gulf Coast. And so I got a hotel close to the Enterprise rental, knowing I would just walk over to Enterprise to pick up my car. It was the worst experience and I've been in 32 countries in the last 6 years. I mean, I almost got run over twice. There were no sidewalks. You're walking through, just muddy, almost fields, just and you're in an urban context. You're in an urban environment. And I think your point is really important to look at it's easy to talk about walkability and live walk scores and all those lofty terms, but until you get out there walk some of these commercial districts. How hard is it to cross this 6-lane highway, that just grew and grew and grew? But then to your other point, and I think this is where, and I worked in, like I said, community activism back in the day, and it's taking your city leaders to the weakest parts of town first, where they don't want to go. I worked in an area called the gun zone, and it was like big signs on the highway saying gun crime means hard time. It's like, wow, that's an attractive investment opportunity right there for the prison system, but not for people wanting to purchase homes there or invest there or start a business there. And so I think we do civically. We also do, I would argue we do a lot of internal branding, don't we, of where not to go. Stay away from this part of town, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that where you put design and effort and time, like you just said, is a way of branding. You're saying this is an area that matters and where we want people to look and invest, and this is an area where we don't. And if you're trying to improve your community, it's easy to focus on like the area that's already working and just kind of keep investing in there. It's a lot harder to go to the heart. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's move on a little bit. Let's talk about technology. I've worked for a long time in smart cities as well. And a lot of cities want to brand themselves around being, technology forward. Innovation districts are a big term these days. But what gets lost when we push technology ahead of civic identity?
Yeah. I think there's so many places that are, doing the innovation district or, trying to lead with that. And I get it. I get why they're doing it. I get why it bubbles to the top, because when they get a focus group and maybe they're doing engagement the right way, they're like, wow, we've got a lot of smart people here. We've got some cool businesses that are doing innovative things. Maybe that's what we should lean into. That's our thing. We're an innovation district. But I think from a city standpoint, innovation needs to be, it can be a layer, but it can't be the lead. It can't be the core thing that you are, right? Because those are the things that change over time, technologies change, industries even change. Like a city needs to be about something, I think, bigger than that, a little bit more universal. So to me, to be honest, I get a little kind of bored with all of the smart city and AI talk at conferences and how that's leading, not because I don't think it's important, and I'm glad there's other people smarter than me focusing on that part of it. But I think from an identity standpoint, you have to have something that's a lot more fundamental. And that, there can be an innovation district within that, but people will know you're innovative, not because you're saying you're innovative, but because they see you being innovative and because you've created an ecosystem where people can come in and be innovative. I mean, we see the same thing with like arts, right? And, every community says they value art, but are they designing it in a way that like makes it affordable for artists and gives it a platform for arts?
Yeah. Can artists afford the
Yeah. So it doesn't matter if you say that you're an arts district or you value art if artists can't afford to live there. So like focus on, can people afford to live there? Can they thrive? Can they prosper? And then they'll make it an arts district or an innovation district or probably hopefully a mix of a lot of things and not just one thing.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing that here in Barcelona as well. There's a lot of micro targeting or sort of urban injection of, okay, this area, Badalona, which is just east up the sea from downtown Barcelona. Badalona is really had been a struggling industrial area for many years and is now getting more targeted focus on what kind of industries and businesses, and it's not the same everywhere. I think they're taking a more targeted view of like this would be a great area for a fashion district or a semiconductor district. It's not all about semiconductors and silicon, everybody trying to be a mini Silicon Valley as much as there were a tradition of garment workers in that area. Maybe a neo garment kind of revitalization goes on, just like letterpress came back in the arts community back in the 90s and 2000s. So I think we're sometimes not granular enough in thinking about what is really local. What was this place historically? And I'll pick on Knoxville again and look at East Knoxville. And there was a Levi's plant there. There was a heavy tradition of the knitting mills and all of that. And I think if you remember that culture and think about what was good about that, and that involves where the buses run, how frequently the buses run, where the bus canopies are, so that those people who can't afford a car don't have to live 20 miles out of town because they can't afford to live in town and work in that district.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, and you see so much of that, especially in areas that have that kind of smaller to medium-sized industrial buildings, because those historic like, in the kinda, like, recent history, were kind of some industries had left, and so you kinda had these areas that cities were eyeing for redevelopment, and so they would look at the scale of those buildings and say like, "Oh, well, this could be repurposed as this. Let's brand this now as an arts district or an innovation district," and that worked really well for a period of time. I mean, you saw a lot of adaptive reuse of industrial buildings all of a sudden became, like, breweries and art studios and innovation spaces, and that was great. I think one thing that's kinda tricky right now is no one's building that size of industrial anymore, that kind of, like, smaller industrial, and so that actually is performing really well.
And the speculators have come in and bought a lot of that stuff up. Right?
Yeah, and so the city may not love this industrial, but, some developers are like, "Well, with your density requirements, I can't do anything more profitable than light industrial there, right? So, like, I'm gonna keep it light industrial." But I think, yeah, I think cities try to sometimes get a little too cute with what are we calling this area, and instead just focus on making it a quality place and let the
Right.
businesses come in and decide, is it gonna be garment or art or industry or a mix of all of the above? You don't have to just pick one and say,
Yeah.
"We are now this."
The city leadership to decide what that's going to be as and yes, we're talking market driven, but we're also again, this is about branding and identity. And whether I think you're arguing that it should be more grassroots than top down. And moving further into that, as I just said, then the speculators come in, then the rents go up, people get priced out. And so the big G word comes up, which is gentrification. And so I'd be really curious your perspective. I have lots of thoughts on gentrification, and I'll keep them to myself for this because I really want to hear from you on how civic branding can push back against gentrification instead of accelerating it. How does it help keep rents lower and bringing in more uh, young people and families and entrepreneurs willing to take a risk, not displacing the people that have historically been there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think gentrification it's a really challenging issue. I'm not gonna pretend to have all of the answers for it, but I do think that historically how places have approached place branding has contributed to gentrification because like you just said, you put an identity, if at it works and it succeeds, things are more successful, so things go up, people get displaced, right? And so when I said we wanted to kind of rebrand place branding and call it a civic brand, well, the difference is a civic brand, one, really, I think you have to get ownership focused. We have to look at like how can the people that live here, do they at least have access and opportunity to own? Because if they can own, even if they do get displaced, well, they benefit in the improve. If my property values go way up and I decide to sell, great. I could take that money and go do what I want with it, right? If there's not that opportunity for ownership, people don't have that say. Their landlord is going to choose to sell and they're going to get pushed out. And so I think a civic brand starts with looking at its locals first and understanding what is the culture? Who's contributing to the culture? And how do we define that and how do we protect that? And I think so there has to be paths to ownership. I think, not to get too into the housing crisis stuff, but I think not enough of the folks working on affordable housing are focused on like true ownership. They're just looking at getting people into like housing, which is a great first step, but it's not to me as long-term productive because we want people to benefit. If your property values go up, you should benefit from that. You shouldn't, that shouldn't be viewed as a problem. So yeah, I think a civic brand gets really intentional about who's contributing to the benefit of this place and who and how do we value them. And make them part of that story because yeah, if somebody else owns it, they're going to do whatever they want with it. And if it's worth more to have a Lululemon there instead of a house, they're going to put that there.
Well, and I think what you're alluding to also points to the correlation between civic brand and identity and zoning and density. Because if a city is unwilling to really take a creative look at zoning and density, because to address the housing crisis writ large, nationally in the US and globally, we have to be looking at new housing typologies that people can afford. Maybe that's more co-housing, maybe that's more shared communal type environments. I live in 365 square feet in the center of Barcelona in Gaza Quarter. I have a very small space. And I've written before about how the city is my living room. And I really enjoy that. And I think if cities could be more creative about their housing typologies, that would also, the Civic brand would inherit that as well, would it not?
Absolutely. And there's a small scale developer in Texas. His name's Derek Avery, and he talks a lot about this idea of revitalization without gentrification. Like, how do you revitalize an area without that? And an example that he gives that I think is just kind of a light bulb moment for me is take a family. So maybe it's, family of four that is currently living in a very dilapidated, rundown house in an area that people may say this area needs to be gentrified. It's run down. These houses are falling apart, right? And his model though and solution for that is, okay, the reason that family can probably afford to live in that size of a house is because it's a dilapidated house. And it's a
Correct.
dilapidated single family home, right? And so yes, if you fixed up that house, the rent, they can't afford that anymore. But if that house was renovated and rebuilt but made into a duplex, they could probably afford to live in half of that house. And it would be nice, it would be newer, it would be better quality for them, and the property owner could rent out the other half. And so that is a way to improve that, because even a family of four, they might not need, I mean, there's a lot of, like, especially like in inner city areas, there's a lot of historic homes. These are like 4,000 square foot, 3,000 square foot homes that are so run down that they're renting for like 800 to $1,000. And so, of course, they're going to get just bulldozed to build something new. But if you can replace it with a duplex, that could be a win win. But in a lot of places, a duplex would be illegal according to zoning, right? And so I 100% agree that the housing typology gets into, and a lot of people would say, what does that have to do with place branding? Because again, they view the branding as like marketing,
It
and they
has
view
everything.
the real stuff, the real city stuff. And yeah, if you've identified those people as contributors to your culture and they're important and you're taking a locals first approach, and that's the message that you're wanting to share, then absolutely your brand should influence your zoning, your
Well,
housing.
yeah, and let's role play that out. And if I were a city leader and I'd say, "Hey, I'll just say something stupid here and say, "Hey, we're the duplex city. We encourage, new housing typologies and new co-housing, co-living situations so that our service workers can afford to live in our city and have a higher quality of life, which also leads to reduced commutes and greater sustainability targets." And that's a successful message that's different than one might often hear, isn't it?
Absolutely. And just another example of that, I mean, where I live in Salida, Colorado, very tourism driven economy, because we have a lot of, river rafting and skiing and a lot of tourism activities that require a lot of service workers and that also require a lot of seasonal guides, whether it's like rafting guides or ski instructors and things like that. And so if that is our brand, it's this outdoor paradise where you can raft and ski and do all of these things. Well, our brand better influence our housing decisions and our zoning decisions so that those service workers and guides can afford to live here. Uh,
And that they're valued and have a voice.
Absolutely. Because a lot of them, some of them, this isn't a derogatory term. They use this term about themselves. They'll call themselves dirt bags, right? They're seasonal workers. They maybe camp or live in their van and they're just here for the summer. And so some of them even struggle to, like, do they even have a voice or a vote? Well, regardless of if they own property or they're technically even a resident, they might like be camping on Forest Service land and working in your restaurants. So they might not even have an address to vote, but they are fundamental to our identity and who we are. And so we need to consider them. So we don't just put raft guides on the brochure for come visit Salida. We need to consider raft guides in our zoning policies, in our housing policies, in our camping policies.
And they're contributors to the economy as well.
100%. Because if we don't have them, these restaurants and these, you know, no one's getting you down the river safely if they can't afford to be here. So,
Right. Well, let's broaden the lens here. Let's go a little international here. In your chapter on stewarding the brand, and I kind of chuckled a little bit. I want to, I don't want to poke the American bear here, but you push back against the what you call the "we're not Europe" mindset, the idea that U.S. cities can't learn from other models. Talk to me a little bit about that. What's your thinking there?
yeah, I mean, I think I mean, one, I think people should be able to learn from people that they like and people that they don't like. You should be able to learn something from everyone, right? I should be able to sit down with somebody that is politically, ideologically opposite of me and learn something from them, even if it's learning what I don't want to be or what I don't think, right? And I think cities need to be the same way. And I think there are a lot of, European cities that have done a lot of amazing things that a lot of US cities could learn from. But the second, a consultant pulls up a slide of like, let's look at Amsterdam or let's look at this, you will just get the biggest pushback of, well, we're not Europe. And even within the US, well, we're not New York City. We're not this. And you're right. You're not. And you may not want to be, but that doesn't mean there's not something you can learn from what they did. And so that's kind of the message. And I think it goes both ways. I think people need to on one side, we need to be more open to learning from other places. On the other side, I think professionals and consultants need to recognize that that's a reality, that people will push back. And so we need to be careful of not just pulling up a European example in the middle of America and saying like, look what they do over here. Cause it's just hard for people to make that connection of how that's relevant to them.
Well, and that's your job as a civic branding person, is to inspire that level of civic imagination. And you call it a failure of civic imagination. And so just some examples are like that I think can be pulled from other city models. Okay. Let's say we're in a mid-sized southern city or a mid-sized city in Colorado or Pueblo. What could Pueblo learn about green belts from Europe, or walking trails, or e-bikes, or just saying e-bike strategies? These all contribute to the brand at the end of the day. But too often, I think you're right. It's almost like a weird kind of civic NIMBYism of, well, we're not New York, we're not Brooklyn, we're not Staten Island, we're not Austin, Texas, and yet we kind of end up with all the same breweries, all the other stuff. But you're like, oh no, 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 we're different.
Yeah.
But planning departments should be working with the tourism folks and the the chief marketing officers to say, there's some really cool stuff that city A or B or C is doing, and we could learn from that.
Yeah.
And you so talk a little bit more about that, because what you're encouraging is borrowing strategies from other cities and experimenting and adapting more, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think it's really interesting that we're talking about this just after we just talked about kind of this like homogenization of design, because I think people could hear that and go, wait, didn't you just say we need to be individual? We need to not all be the same. And I think that's the challenge. That's the difference is a city does need to be unique. It does need to be different. It needs to understand what it is. But at the same time, cities aren't, you don't need to go at your own to address parking, to address affordable housing. All these cities, too often cities think that they're the only ones. Every city we work with, like, well, downtown has a parking problem. It's like, well, every downtown has a parking problem. Every place has challenge, right? And so there is a point where best practices are best practices. Like we can learn and be students of the world and look at what places are doing. And that doesn't mean you are copying their entire identity. So like I said before, I live in Salida, Colorado. An hour from us is Breckenridge, Colorado. I think Breckenridge is a master class in parking management. They've designed a system where you can come to Breckenridge in a car, park your car once, and you don't have to get in that car again the whole time you're there. Well, just an hour away. So this isn't Europe. This is just an hour away. If you were to suggest in Salida, hey, look at what Breckenridge is. Whoa, they would say, don't Breck us. We don't want to become Breckenridge. Just because you emulate their parking strategy is not going to turn you into the negative things that you think about Breckenridge. Because the negative things that people here would have about Breckenridge has to do more with, well, they're right off of I-70 and they have a ski resort in the middle of their downtown. Like that's what's contributing to their housing issues and the things that you don't like about that. It's not their parking strategy. So we need to be able to separate the two in our minds.
Exactly. And I think some other examples of that. So parking strategies, urban technologies that cities are using, the use of tramways, or, just different mobility systems, for example. These are things that, don't make it all homogenized, but we do learn what's working. How do we move people more fluidly with less carbon emissions and make the city a better place? But that doesn't You're right, and I think we're on the same page here of just making sure that homogeneity is one discussion, but learning and benchmarking, world class solutions is always a good thing as well.
Yeah, well, and I think you have to get the order right. I think you have to get the basics right first, and then you build on top of the basics with what's custom for you. And the analogy that I like to think about is like, a city will invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in like a comprehensive plan or this like master plan. And they'll always say, we don't want a cookie cutter plan. We want it to be unique to us. However, there's a lot of things that they probably need to do that are just the basics. You should want a cookie cutter plan. You need to solve these very basic things. And once you've done those things, then you've like earned your right to do the custom things. And I think an analogy is if you think about like health and fitness, right? If someone's out of shape, they don't need to go hire an Olympic level personal trainer that's going to dial in the like perfect diet and exercise plan for them. They probably need to start with the basics of like, maybe they should just walk more or exercise or eat a little bit better. Once they've done those things, if their goals are higher, okay, I've done the basics. I now am trying to like qualify for a marathon or do an Ironman or do something. Yeah, then maybe you need the expert to come in and give you the dialed in prescribed diet and exercise plan. But that's after you've done the basics. And so I think not enough cities are getting the basics right. And they're trying to skip to, well, we want this custom, unique plan just for our random suburb, right? It's like, well, let's get the basics right and then figure out who do we want to be up beyond that.
Yeah. Oh, that's really great. And you described this as kind of a global civic literacy, right? Of that ability to learn from anywhere. And so let's jump into some of those because there were a couple of things you mentioned in the book, and we could talk about Barcelona, but that could be an entire conversation because Barcelona is much more than just a tourism city, and kind of the birthplace of the term urbanization itself. I was at the Smart City Expo World Congress this week, and we could talk all day about smart cities and innovation districts as well. But I think a more interesting case study here that you mentioned was that naturally occurring civic brand, the case study you found in Costa Rica. You want to talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, anybody that's been to Costa Rica, you're going to come back saying Pura Vida, right? And it's amazing because if you go to Costa Rica, that phrase, that saying, it's everywhere. It's on every shirt, license plate. I even saw it like on a bathroom, like a restaurant's bathroom was like broken. And instead of like, it was like, sorry, our bathroom is broken. Instead of saying like sign to the management, it was just like Pura Vida, like just like their sign off. They say it when you take a picture instead of like cheese, they say Pura Vida. And it's this cultural way of life, but it's not a campaign. Like, there isn't like an official logo for it. Somebody doesn't own it. It's just this very natural kind of like slogan slash vibe slash way of life that speaks to their pace and it's very authentic. And so, that's really hard to have something like that so singularly like capture what people feel and believe about a place. That's ultimately the goal. Sometimes an outside entity can kind of step in and try to give people the words, because that's what we do a lot of times is we'll hear all these people describing a place and they're kind of saying it in all different ways, but they're kind of, you see that they're kind of touching on a similar thing. And sometimes we can give them a shared language and the shared words that all of a sudden they're like, yeah, that's what we mean. And then just having the same words, they can use it. But in Costa Rica's case, it's such a just organic, natural thing that I think another place can't just go fabricate that and create that. But I think we can really look at that and take some lessons from it, like the fact that like no one owns it. In branding, we like to try to control things and own things. That's why there's like brand guidelines that say all the rules of like how much space needs to be around a logo and this is the exact color of red. That can all be really important for like locked in branding. But the ultimate goal should be to design and create a brand that the people feel like they own and that no entity owns. And so I just think Costa Rica and that Pura Vida is such a great example of that.
That's really good. And then you also mentioned Detroit. What are your experiential lessons with, whether you work there or just have, more opinions about it? But, as a civic brand, Detroit's been through a rough time the last, you know, 30 or 40 years, honestly. So let's talk about Detroit for a second.
Yeah, so I mean, we haven't worked with Detroit, so this is just kind of observational looking at an iconic US city, so a lot of people know about it. kind of to that idea of like, we can learn kind of back to that, like we can learn something from every place. Detroit is really interesting because, obviously the whole auto industry was like centered around them. And when that went away, it really struggled. But I think what's been interesting and what the lesson has been is, for anybody that's been to Detroit recently, how they have sort of started to reinvent themselves and they are kind of coming into their own. But when you look under when you really pull the curtain back and look at it, it's kind of the same thing. It's the same thing that happened when they were in the auto industry of this, like, there is still this level of grit. There is this level of like, that works with we were talking about adaptive reuse and industrial buildings. So it might look different. It might be a little bit more art. It might be a little more creativity, but it's still based in very much the same things that before of, kind of this like blue collar, a little bit of grit, a little bit of scrappiness, that I think is what created the American auto industry in the first place. Obviously, it ballooned, got super wealthy, and then collapsed, at least there as far as where things are fabricated. But yeah, I mean, I think cities one need to not be afraid to like reinvent themselves, but when they do, man, if they can still stay core to like who they are and what they were, then they're gonna have a better shot. It's Detroit didn't just go, okay, now we're gonna become like San Francisco and be,
Hmm.
rep nation, reinvented themselves in a way that was still worked with what they were.
Yeah. And so I think that leads us to this idea that a city's narrative is both its inheritance and its strategy. And you're talking to an avid storyteller here. And storytelling, you mentioned in the book, does function as civic infrastructure. And sometimes it's about claiming the city's past mistakes to be able to look at future possibility. And you've got some great case studies here. And I think in the time we've got, let's move it. Let's start with High Point, North Carolina. I grew up in Western North Carolina. I know it is the furniture capital of the world that some people claim. So, how has that evolved from both its inheritance and its future strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so we started working with High Point, I guess it's probably been 3 years ago now. And yeah, furniture capital of the world. But where they were at from a city identity standpoint was, hey, we still have this furniture industry. It's really important. It's really valuable. We're not trying to turn our backs on that because it's important. But we have some real challenges in our community with like food deserts, and downtown isn't really activated. And we have all these people that are in High Point, but they're not part of the furniture industry. And when we engage with those folks, we would talk to them and they would say, well, yeah, we appreciate and we respect the furniture industry, but what does that mean for me? Like, I'm not part of that. So, a city that's identity is just based on that, they don't feel connected to that. They don't feel part of that. And so the city was at this weird spot. They were like, we want to have an identity that represents all of these people, but we don't want to like turn our backs on the furniture industry because that's like still our thing, right? And so when we unpacked that and we understood, well, what is it about the furniture industry that like people have pride and identity around? And a lot of it was this like, they're creating something, and they're creating something that is being distributed around the world and is having an impact around the world. And so when we took that language and kind of broadened it out and helped people see that, like, in High Point, it doesn't matter if you're making furniture or you're making a latte or you're starting a business or you're a stay at home mom that's creating a family. The point is, like, you're creating something, and High Point's a great place to create something. And the things that are being created in High Point are changing the world. And just by helping people show what they were already doing, showing that barista that felt like they weren't creating anything, no, you are creating something, and showing that stay at home mom, like, no, you are creating something. It just created this like buzz within and momentum within the community there where people just felt like they were like, you know what, you're right, I am. So it wasn't even like a rebrand or a change. It was just helping people see what they were already doing that was valuable. And it's been amazing to see what High Point has done with this brand that we helped them not create, but just tighten and define. And they've gone on to solve some really big challenges. They're now addressing food deserts, and they're activating their downtown because they're seeing that, like, their downtown. It was interesting. I remember touring their downtown when we first went there, and it was beautiful, like, because it was all these like showrooms for the furniture industry, but there was nobody in them, and they weren't even open because it was like invite only showrooms. You make an appointment and you go in. So like, it looked good, it was kept up, but no one was walking around. There was nothing going on. And so they're using that, High Point is creative, we're creators. to like shape their policies of like, well, if we're a creative place, like we need to do creative placemaking. Our built environment needs to feel creative. It needs to spark creativity. And so they're doing placemaking activations in their downtown. And so if you look at this, the things that High Point has started to address, food deserts, activating downtown, the brand maybe didn't solve food deserts, but the brand gave their residents the momentum and the power to go then solve those problems. So you can't
And
solve those problems without a.
in the sense of belonging as well, right? That we're
Absolutely,
all
yeah,
in. Yeah.
yeah, they felt like a real community, and they saw that they were one thing together. And I think, I mean, if you can look at a lot of cities, I mean, New York City, the city, people say like, if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. And they have this kind of like hustle, vibe that kind of comes from like the Broadway, like theater, right? People are like kind of like hustling on the like on the Broadway stage. But most people in Manhattan aren't on Broadway, but they share some of that value and characteristics, right? And so I think a city can have its main thing, but the main things like values and characteristics can bleed out to the rest of the community.
Sure. Well, let's move on to Austin, Texas. Weirdly Austin, keeping Austin weird. How does that work as a cultural compass for a city?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's another one that, I think there was an entity that first said keep Austin weird, but it's kind of been one of those things that like it became the people's thing, right? Like it wasn't, the people felt like that was their thing. And even as they evolved from like not just being a music city into being more of this like tech startup hub, it has been a compass that has helped them shape their decisions. And Austin has grown a ton. And if you talk to people that are from there, they'll tell you it's changed. And everybody will say that about every city. It's like, it's changed. It's not like it was. It's not as weird as it was, or it's not as cool as it was. And it has changed and it has grown. But I think Austin has, from a culture standpoint, really done a good job of that being their compass. And that shapes, how they approach mixed use and how they approach certain, development decisions. And, you know, certain emotions and just different things that you think about Austin. And there's so many cities that are trying to replicate that, but they try to replicate it just through a campaign and by saying their city name is weird.
Yeah. And well, and I think, but I really like this idea of cultural compass because, and I go back to Knoxville at the top, the Scruffy City. That's not an official moniker or a brand. That's grassroots. And I think part of the challenge for a city like Austin or Nashville, for example, are they're pretty damn successful as cities, right? And that success breeds a lot of dissatisfaction because it's not as weird as it was. It's gotten too big for its britches, as we say in the South, right? And so that's a fascinating study as well, is how do you keep your cultural compass pointing north when you've got all this tech and I've been reading some articles recently on challenges of some of the tech startups around Austin. And how do you take a local quirk, hold on to it, but still evolve that policy, that culture and that identity?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's tough. I mean, I do think it's really hard because, I mean, managing change is tough, right? You're gonna, but when you have a brand that you've defined, at least you can better protect something that you've defined than you can something you haven't defined, right? If they hadn't had that slogan, they hadn't said, I think they would have lost it way more than they have by now. But by at least being able to like, if you can name it, you can protect it, right? And so I think that's kind of a value of branding is like, let's define what we want to protect. And, we talked about Cracker Barrel earlier. You know, I think a couple weeks after the Cracker Barrel stuff, the city of Austin kind of stepped in it a little bit with their rollout of like their city logo. And I definitely don't want to pile on anymore and on that. But I think what's interesting about that was everything that we're talking about with Austin and the Keep Austin Weird, that's a cultural brand, like a true like civic brand. And the Austin logo that was in the news, that was the city government's logo. And those are two different things. And I think that's something we try to navigate a lot and help our clients understand is when they're talking about a city's brand, are we talking about Austin, the place? Or are we talking about the governmental organization, the entity? And those sometimes are very different things, but in people's minds, they're sometimes blurry and they're the same. The
Yeah.
city government's logo.
It's much more organic in people's minds and more
Yeah,
fluid.
right.
That's a really good one. And then so we've talked a lot about this, good design sameness that we talked at the top of the conversation. So looking at authenticity as ethical branding and using Santa Fe, New Mexico as an example here, talk to me about how authenticity can contribute to, genuine roots and not just historic imitation.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. Santa Fe was a community that we did work with, and in the book, I actually interviewed the mayor of Santa Fe, Mayor Alan Weber. And one thing that we talked about in that conversation was, Santa Fe had a lot of conflict currently, right? They had, there's a lot of people that wanted to change and kind of grow up, and then those that wanted to kind of maintain. It's like historic and artistic, and so there's this conflict. And we were talking about how if you look though at Santa Fe's past, their entire history is about conflict. I mean, that was you had, different countries coming together, like literal conflict, like battles. And their culture and identity was almost created out of conflict. And so sometimes you embracing the challenges and dualities and conflict can create a strong identity. And I think Santa Fe, that's a big part of it, is that conflict and the history is authentically part of Santa Fe. And I think a place like Santa Fe that like has an aesthetic, I think, that comes to mind. If anybody's been to say, they start picturing things, you can start to picture the architecture. And I think it's sometimes a little too easy to like get too on the nose from a design standpoint. And I remember I shared this in the book too, but I remember we were doing a rafting trip here in Colorado, and our guide was asking me like, what do we do? What do I do for a living? And I told him, I work with cities, and I was working with Santa Fe. And he made the joke. He was like, I'm thinking turquoise, like as like the brand, and it's like, yeah, like that's so like on the nose. Do
With
you
maybe in
lean
a
in?
dirty background. Oh my goodness, that's
Right.
profound.
And I think, from a visit Santa Fe standpoint, it's easy to lean into that. And like you're trying to sell it. So yeah, let's sell the turquoise and let's sell the this and that. But I think it is important for a city that has an aesthetic to like that to protect that aesthetic, but also recognize that like conflict and difference in bringing different cultures and groups and races together, that's what made Santa Fe. And so we need to embrace that, and we need to make that part of that storytelling as well.
So give me some examples of how would that manifest into some storytelling, or what are some activations or things that you guys have been involved with Santa Fe?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Our project with Santa Fe was, not a citywide brand, but there was a university right in the heart of Santa Fe that basically it was a private university that basically closed. And so all of a sudden the city acquired this property, and there was 30 acres like right in the heart of the city. So it was this like really unique opportunity to like create an entirely different, district and neighborhood in Santa Fe. And so there was a lot of conversations around what do we want this to be? What should this be? Right. And we don't want to just replicate like the plaza and like, the downtown. We don't want it to just be this like mixed use development that again is that homogenous design and loses its soul. And so our role, was very early on in that project. That's a long-term project, was just doing that engagement though, and listening to like, because Santa Fe means so many different things to so many people. And I think from a visitor, they immediately go to like the cliches of what you would think is Santa Fe. But that's maybe not what that neighborhood needs, and maybe not, what the opportunity is. And so I think it's just hearing all sides, like how do we respect the history, and we want it to feel authentically Santa Fe, but we don't want it to just become a caricature of itself. And so, our role was again limited in scope, but it was helping them kind of work through those challenges of like, how can we be authentically Santa Fe? But people that are in Santa Fe, they don't just want another on the nose caricature tourist thing. They want,
Plumber, you know,
yeah, they want jobs, places to work and things to do. And that's a tricky balance, and it's kind of a once in a generation opportunity when a property like that becomes available to make it a true like seamless integrated neighborhood versus just a master plan development.
well, I think master plan development is the key phrase here, and okay, 30 acres. Oh wow, developers are salivating. We already know what we want to do. It's going to be mixed use. There's going to be a green belt. There's going to be a little lake, or I don't know. I'm just spitballing here, but I'm imagining those conversations are already at play in City Hall and in developers' offices. But to really go on a listening tour where you're listening and not selling, you know, you're not just
Yeah.
communicating outward, it's a dialogue. What you talk about is collecting cultural intelligence. And maybe there's 10 or 12 use cases that would suit that 30-acre site. I don't know. But that sounds like a really exciting opportunity, as you say, to design culture and not just a district,
Yeah,
correct?
and that's where I think I really respect how the city approached that project because the timeline actually would have been a lot faster to just put out an RFP for a developer, they come in and do a master plan, and they do what they would wanna do. But the city recognized, again, this is a once in a generation opportunity. We can't just let a developer come do what they want to do. We need to do what Santa Fe needs and what the people of Santa Fe want. And so the city created that vision of this is what we want to be. And they're looking for multiple developers to come in and play smaller, different pieces so that it is more organic. It's not overly master planned. And it's created almost like a city was created, like Santa Fe was created. Santa Fe wasn't master planned and all built at once, right? And so that might slow down the process a little bit of redevelopment, whereas you could have a developer breaking ground tomorrow, you know, but I think it's the right call. And so I really respected how they approached that project.
I think that's a great example of cultural intelligence becoming civic branding. And so, yeah, I guess that sounds so profound, but I've been there and I know how hard it is to convince policymakers and planners to think differently and not just, in the ear of the developer or the developer in the ear of the city leaders. So how do you make that work? I mean, obviously Santa Fe leadership was there, but I guess I'm almost speechless because they're thinking culturally, not just economically, not just bottom line profit to a developer. And that's sort of, I mean, my jaw is dropping slightly.
Yeah. I mean, I think it gets back to that kind of that triple bottom line piece, right? If you're just profit focused, it probably would be more profitable for the city to get that developed by a single developer as quick as possible, right? And I can't take the credit for, the city leadership was thinking about things the right way and that's why they brought us in to do that work and help them figure that out. We didn't necessarily convince them to do that. I wish I could take credit for that. But I think, I mean, I think it was Santa Fe has so many pressures that I think it was a very heightened thing of, man, we can't just, I mean, even like the McDonald's in Santa Fe kind of looks like Santa Fe, right? They do a good job of like, you're going to conform to us. We're not going to bend over backwards and conform to you, an outside corporate brand. And so that naturally, I think, extended to how they approach this development project is we're not going to just conform to whatever some outside developer wants to do. We're going to say, what does Santa Fe want to do? And then we're going to look for the right partners to help us achieve that.
Love it. Is that a hard thing? Is that an exception to the rule? How can cities reclaim agency?
Yeah.
That's ethically, culturally, creatively, as we've talked extensively about this era of sameness.
Yeah, I think it comes down ultimately to confidence, right? If you're not confident and you have that kind of, there's been a lot of talk the last couple of years, like scarcity mindset and things like that. Like, if you're not confident and you have a scarcity mindset that like we need outsiders to come in and fix our city, we need visitors to come in, you're gonna accept and be willing to take whatever. But if you have confidence, and it's easy to do when things are going well, right? Like when you're doing well, you're going to say no to certain things, but when you're starving and hurting, you might say yes to things you probably otherwise wouldn't have. And I think there's a lot of places and cities that are operating from that point of weakness but I think that's where like a brand like in High Point, nothing really changed, but all of a sudden they had confidence and they were like, no, wait, we're High Point. We can dictate our own terms. We can say what developers and corporations and outside entities can and can't do. And I think that's the key is just getting people and cities to have that confidence to go, no, this is who we are. This is where we're headed. And yeah, let's work with us. Visitor, this is who we are and where we're headed, but a visitor is going to conform to us. A developer is going to conform to us.
And that's not anti-business, I would add. I mean, it's often portrayed that way. It's the people versus the developers in many, many instances that I have witnessed and experienced. And I feel like this is not rocket science, but many cities and neighborhoods get it wrong. So in the few minutes we've got left, let's jump into a little bit of discussion on what does civic branding look like in the era of AI? Can't we just automate all this stuff and have it spit out what we should be about ourselves? How does that work? And where does your civic brand and your book go next?
Yeah, I mean, on AI, like I said, I just returned from a conference and there's a lot of sessions about AI. And the best analogy that I heard just of how to think about AI is they kind of use Tiger Woods, right? He's the expert, he's the pro golfer, but Tiger Woods has a caddy. And the caddy is not taking the shots for him, is not doing the things. Tiger still has to be Tiger, but the caddy can offer some advice. He can bounce ideas off of him in real time. You know, can help him run through scenarios. Can do a little analysis on which way the green's running, and provide help him. So I'm definitely not an anti AI person, but I think we need to approach it like a caddy. Like we still have to take the shots. We still have to make the calls and, you know, but if used right, I think it can be like a research partner. We can bounce ideas off of it. And so that's kind of generally how I approach it, both like personally within work, but can we get to a point where you're just create a brand, create an identity? I don't I don't think so. But I think what you do is you could say, "Hey, we're a community that values X, Y, and Z. How should that influence our housing policy? Can you scan our zoning and land use code and surface areas where maybe we're contradicting our brand?" Well, I bet AI could surface some things pretty quickly, you know, and I think that could be a good way to use it.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I view it as a more of an executive assistant, allowing me to do deep dive research into a topic. And I think particularly AI is good at benchmarking. What are other cities doing? And we're not Europe. We don't look at other cities. Wink, wink. Let's go look at other cities. Give me a deep dive on, cities, not just in North America, but worldwide of a population of X that are using, you know, scooter or whatever your topic happens to be.
Yeah, I mean, one example just on the AI that from that conference that I saw, like, and kind of speaking to what we were just talking about is like, I think the website is like One Provence in France, and they've basically built a website that's powered by AI that, you know, can look through all of their tourism assets, everything they have, and where instead of a user having to look up like, well, what can be built here? What's a zoning code? Where are good places to eat? You know, they're just talking to the website and it'll surface that information. And so I think that's a good example of like using that technology to shape the message and kind of deliver the content in a really like instant, but still like it's still their content, right? They're still like creating the content that their AI is indexing and serving back up. So I think that's just one example. Kind of getting back to that destination management a little bit, you know, we want to make sure that we're not just spitting out the like, we're giving everybody the same 5 places to go, right? Because destination management is a lot about distribution, getting people off the beaten path. And so I think as we can work with AI and understand like AI optimization as a place brander or place management, we can start to have AI help us distribute people versus just, oh, we'll send them here, here, and here. And all of a sudden everybody goes to the exact same spots at the exact same time.
I think to your point, your AI optimization feeds directly into your destination management, as you mentioned earlier, and that sounds like a really exciting opportunity for the different stakeholders within the city to really work together and to kind of cross discipline from the tourism folks to the transit folks. And do we need to offer more shuttles during these 2 months of the year that can make sure we get enough people out to this gorgeous park that nobody sees, as a
Absolutely.
dumb example? But yeah, that's a really, I think, useful example or case study. So, I think you would argue that the future of cities is going to be co-authored by its citizens, and the stories that result out of the High Points and the Austins and the Santa Fe's, and not just top down leadership and developer driven. So what does that future look like? What final thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah. I mean, I think some people might think this is hyperbole when I say it, but I genuinely believe that the only chance we have to ultimately save our planet is if we're saving individual places along the way. If we can collectively save all these individual places, we'll start to solve some really big problems. And so because of that, I think, you know, people need to focus on their neighborhood, their town, their region, and, you know, take that triple bottom line, create an identity and protect it. And I think if we do that, and more places do that, I think that's the problem is like everything that I talk about, when just a couple places do it, it doesn't work because that place just becomes, It's like when you have one walkable town, it's not great because it gets overpriced because it's desirable and everybody wants to go there. But if all places were walkable, it would even things out. It would be a little bit better. And so that's my hope in for the future of cities, is that all places can kind of become the best version of themselves. And it's not just the big highlight hottest cities, but like literally the random town that no one would consider visiting, the random suburb. How can that just become a better version of itself? And I think if all the places can kind of level up, I think we have a shot. And I think it's important because we do have some pretty rich and powerful people that I think are actively trying to do the opposite. And so there's a lot of kind of forces against that. But I think place is worth being a little more intentional about than maybe we have been.
Very well said. Ryan Short, your book is The Civic Brand, your agency, Civic Brand. It's been a pleasure having you on Citizen One today, and I really appreciate you joining.
Yeah, this has been great. Thanks for your time, Doug.
Awesome. And this is Douglas Stewart McDaniel, Citizen One, exploring our urban future, an Urban Next original podcast series. And I hope you will join the Substack, learn more about all of the work we're doing, and my debut novel, Ghost Emperor, which hits Kindle and Amazon and paperback on November 18th. So thank you again, Ryan.
Thanks.
Yeah.